Hi everyone, Matthew DeSantis here with NYRA Bets, and welcome to another episode of Track Stats on NYRA Bets YouTube. Well, listen, before we get into this video, sharing the ins and outs of how the track is playing up here at the spa, make sure to press that like button on YouTube and subscribe to the new NYRA Bets YouTube channel. We got a lot of great content coming for you this week. We have graded stakes previews at Colonial Downs. Got a good friend of mine coming on to preview some of those really exciting races that they have. They're going to be running Sunday because of Tropical Storm Debbie, and we'll talk a little bit more about Debbie later in this video as it pertains to some of the track stats that I'm going to be sharing. But listen, they got the Secretariat Stakes, you got the Beverly D, you got the Arlington Million. That's going to be a lot of fun. Also going to have a very special guest to talk about our turf races that we have up here in New York that are going to be run this weekend, the 4-Star Dave and the Saratoga Derby. So I'm going to have graded stakes previews for both of those. Definitely want to make sure to check all of that out. Like I said, press that subscribe button. So let's dive into track stats, though. And for those of you who may not be familiar with track stats, what is it? Well, I look at two things primarily, but there's a lot of nuance within that. I look at how are post-time favorites performing, and I look at the winning trip analysis by surface and by distance. Why do I do that? In an effort to give you, the player, a little bit more data. Now, why do I look at something like how post-time favorites perform? Well, sometimes you can start to see certain trends emerge in that. You can start to see certain surfaces or certain levels of competition tend to be either more or less chalky than others. And so this can be something that can be helpful when you're putting together a ticket, thinking about how do you approach a particular race. Winning trip analysis, pretty straightforward. How is the track playing to different types of runners? Very classic example of this was a couple months ago, back in the winter actually, in the Cigar Mile. I was all the way against Senior Buscador in that race. Why? Because if you paid attention to track stats, you knew no horse was making up significant ground from the back to win going a mile on the dirt at Aqueduct. And so a deep closer like Senior Buscador, he was one of the first horses I drew a line through because I knew the track was not playing to what he does well. So those are the types of reasons you want to be paying attention to track stats. And let's dive in to some really exciting numbers this week. So just as an overview of how is the track doing in terms of post-time favorites, about 32% of post-time favorites are winning at Saratoga. That number's up just a little bit from last week, but still well below what we tend to see out of these significant meets. You think about the championship meet at Gulfstream Park, close to 40% of favorites are winning there. Tampa Bay Downs, close to 40% of favorites. Santa Anita, over 40%. Even Aqueduct was about 37, 38%. Really the only tracks that are close to this in terms of a relatively low percentage of favorites winning are Turfway Park over the winter and Oaklawn Park as well. Those are two tracks that we have actually pretty similar stats for in terms of how they're performing, in terms of favorites, etc. So it's definitely good to be able to see, hey, we can catch a price here. This is not too chalky of a track, and it's not been a particularly chalky meet. We've had about 12% of winners get home at 10-1 or higher. That's a pretty good percentage. Again, comparing that to some other tracks that we've looked at in the past, that number is usually hovering somewhere between 8 and 10%. So for it to be at 12%, shows a rather robust amount of horses coming home at a pretty big price. Now, if you're a chalk player and you just like betting the chalk every single race, listen, you're not doing too well. You're down 23% for the meet because a $2 bet on the post-time favorite is only bringing back $1.54. But one of the things I like looking at is how are favorites doing by levels of favoritism? So naturally, an overwhelming favorite, a horse like Next, let's say in the Birdstone, who was 1-9, should absolutely be winning that race 95, 99, 99.999% of the time. Now, on the other side, you could have some 7-2 lukewarm favorite in an allowance race. Well, that horse is statistically only going to win that race maybe 1 out of 3, 1 out of 4 times. So you're not expecting the same sort of thing from those two horses. So looking at how below even money horses are doing at Saratoga, there's been 47 of those, only 55% winners. I say only because even though it's the biggest number on the screen, it's supposed to be, first of all, these are your heaviest favorites. They're supposed to win at the highest rate. But An even money favorite is statistically meant to represent a horse that will win the race half the time. So the fact that the 47 horses that are below even money are only winning at a 55% rate, they're really not that invincible. Yes, you might have a horse like Next who wins by 21 lengths at 1-9, but you've also had horses, I'll give you an example, a horse like Drake's Passage, who was an off the turf, very heavy favorite in the final race on the Whitney Day card. That horse was 2-5 and finished last. So you've seen some of these below even money favorites kind of underperform a little bit. Again, comparing how this number stacks up to other tracks, track like Santa Anita, generally we saw 65, almost 70% of these below even money favorites winning. Same thing true championship meet at Gulfstream Park. So 55% rather low. 83% of them are finishing in the money. So certainly if you're thinking about building out your exactas, trifectas, excluding from those might be a little foolish. But the number highlighted in red that I thought was particularly interesting is how even money to 9-5 favorites are performing. These are still very good horses with regards to, and very strong favorites with regards to their chances of potentially winning the race. And yet they're only winning at a 24% clip. That's well below what statistically they're representing with regards to those odds. They're finishing in the top 3 at a 61% clip. This is a really low number. Generally, we see this number into the 30s, sometimes as high as 40% at different tracks. For it to be at 24 really tells you can feel confident taking a shot against favorites in some of these fields. And even a horse that's a 6-5, 7-5, 8-5 favorite, they're hardly invincible up here at Saratoga. Feel confident taking a shot against those types of horses. Interestingly enough, your 2-1, 5-2, and 3-1 horses are actually performing a little bit better than your even money and 9-5 horses, winning at a 30% clip. And then there's a very limited number of horses that have been favorites at 7-2 or higher. Only 8 of those, none of them have won. Half of them have managed to finish in the top 3. But I think one of the things that I would stress, just if you were like, Matthew, what's the one thing I should take away from this slide? Try to beat chalk is the overwhelming advice that I would give. And honestly, the numbers back that up. Chalk is not winning at an overwhelming rate. If you're betting favorites, you're losing. And so you want to take a shot against betting favorites. I know my good friend, Sarah El Badwi, listen, her Twitter handle is Outrun the Odds. She's always going to give out those big prices. I do a column on long shot of the day. Try to always think through, where can we attack favorites? Where can we find a price? That's something that's always important as a horse player. So let's talk a little bit about where have we seen favorites perform their best and their worst. So where have we seen them do well? Maiden claiming races. 45% of maiden claiming races have been won by your post-time favorite. Maybe not that surprising if you think about it, especially during the Saratoga meet. During Saratoga, people want to get a win at Saratoga. And so you will see owners, trainers, connections dropping a horse in for a claiming tag in the maiden ranks. Even if that horse, maybe it was a pretty respectable maiden special weight runner, they want to get that win. They want to say, hey, we won at Saratoga. And so you will see some pretty significant horses getting dropped into a $40,000 maiden claiming race or a $75,000 maiden claiming race. We have some of those. You see this at Churchill Downs as well. You'll see some really big money maiden claiming races. Sometimes out at Santa Anita, you'll even see a $150,000 maiden claiming race. So you'll see some of these during big meets, and it's just something to keep in mind. People are dropping their some pretty nice horses into these races in order to get a win. Off-turf races also yielding a high percentage of favorites, 47.6%. Again, not surprising. What happens? Two things. One, in an off-turf race, there are scratches, so the field's going to be smaller. Second, it usually brings in main track only entries. These are dirt horse specialists, often wet dirt specialists, and you tend to see pretty strong favorites from those fields, and they come through and manage to get the win. So not surprising to see off-turf races doing well, but I think one of the things to keep in mind when you're playing off-turf races is just knowing this and sometimes leaning into it. And that means sometimes singling a horse in an off-turf race and just knowing, listen, this is probably going to be a chalky sequence where maybe there's 2 or 3 off-turf races out of a 5-race sequence. And listen, maybe I'm just going to single one or two horses in that sequence, and I'm going to be allowed to spread in a couple of others a little bit more. I can still put together an affordable ticket while even getting a predictable favorite home. So where are favorites doing poorly? Well, dirt shoot races. So only 2 out of 11 winners have been your post-time favorite coming out of the chute for races specifically carded for the dirt. So something to keep in mind there. We'll talk a little bit more about the nuance to that in a second. And then claiming races, 21.9% of favorites winning those. And again, I think that speaks to just the competitive nature of these fields and also how many different types of horses are coming in from other tracks. So for these claiming races at Saratoga, we certainly have your New York horses, but we have horses coming up from Churchill Downs. We have horses coming down from Woodbine. We have horses coming up from Florida. We have horses coming up from the Mid-Atlantic like Laurel, Pimlico, Delaware Park. So we have a lot of horses coming from a lot of different tracks that sometimes can create a lot of chaos, and it can also create just really competitive fields. I would actually draw a very close comparison to a track like Oaklawn Park. I mentioned before, Oaklawn, if you've ever followed it, is a very similar dynamic where it's a track that brings together a confluence of different horses from Texas, from Louisiana, from Florida, from Kentucky, from Oklahoma, from Iowa. So you get all of these different horses coming in, and sometimes it takes a little while for the betting public to figure out what's the proper pecking order. So one of the things we've seen at Saratoga is we've seen Churchill Downs shippers do very well. So that's something to keep in mind. If you see a horse having previously run at Churchill Downs coming up here to Saratoga, sometimes that deserves a little extra check next to that horse's name. Well, let's talk about some of the winning trip analysis. And in particular, I wanted to share some disaggregated data between how horses are winning coming out of the chute for races specifically carded for the dirt versus those races coming out of the chute that have been off-turf races. Now, remember, when we're talking about off-turf chute races, these are races that were originally carded for the grass that were going either 8 furlongs or a mile or going a mile and a 16th. Those mile and a 16th races always get cut back and put into the chute going a mile. And we do see a little bit of difference here. If you look at how the chute is playing for races carded for the dirt, incredibly fair. So about 36% of horses have gone gate to wire, 36% have tracked within 3 lengths of the pace, and 27% have closed from more than 3 lengths back. That's actually, as a player, that's kind of what you want to see. It doesn't really show much of a track bias. Now, your off-turf chute races do show a little bit more of a bias in terms of what type of running style tends to work well. Gate to wire winners, very few, only 1 out of 12, 8%. Tracking trip, 58%. Closers, 33%. So that tracking trip has been the really effective one. Something to obviously keep in mind when we're talking about off-turf races running out of the chute. Sometimes this will still feature a lot of turf horses. Turf horses tend to like to come from off the pace. So you might not have quite as many top quality front runners in these types of fields. That's something to certainly to keep in mind that could be influencing that winning trip analysis. But I know a lot of times people assume coming out of the chute, oh, inside controlling speed is the way to go. It's not bad. I don't mind inside controlling speed. If you break from one of the, 3 or 4 inside post positions, or maybe you're somebody who wants to be further outside, although we saw that be a little bit of a fiasco today coming out of the chute in one particular race. So, it just depends. But usually you go, oh, controlling speed, that's where you want to be. Well, not always, not necessarily. That tracking trip, that closing trip has been effective both for races specifically carded for the dirt, as well as those coming off the turf and coming out of the chute. Well, let's talk about turf routes, because believe it or not, we are eventually going to get to turf racing this weekend. And I wanted to share that off-turf data as it relates to the chute with you because, listen, there's no sense bearing the lead here. Tropical Storm Debbie is coming up the Mid-Atlantic. It's interrupting a lot of racing going on at Colonial Downs, Virginia, Delaware Park. A lot of different tracks are being affected by this. Obviously, we might very well be affected by it as well up here in upstate New York. And so we're expecting a good amount of rain, potentially 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 inches of rain sometime between Friday morning, basically, and Saturday morning. So that's when we're going to get our biggest totals is probably most of the day Friday. So obviously there's possibility some of these turf races Saturday get taken off. There's already been a contingency plan put in place that if we do go off turf on Saturday, that both the Saratoga Derby and the 4-Star Dave will be run on Sunday instead. So something to keep in mind, but we are going to get to the turf one way or the other. And the good news is after Tropical Storm Debbie gets out of the way, we really do have some beautiful weather lined up for the following week, which is Alabama week. So excited for that. But wanted to show you turf routes and disaggregating between the inner turf and the melon turf. One of the things that you should see here immediately that should pop off the screen is that gate to wire winners, they're not happening very often. Now, I don't want to say the track's bias against gate to wire winners. We just haven't seen many of them. But then again, I often will tell people, list off 5 or 6 top quality gate to wire front running turf routers. There just aren't as many. Most turf routers like to come from a little off the pace. They have that devastating turn of foot at the end. That said, you can still think of a few prominent gate to wire winners that we've seen so far this meet. Horse like White Beam in the Diana, horse like the Big Torpedo, horse like Laurel Valley. All these horses won in gate to wire fashion. They were all favorites or very strong contenders in each of those races. So something to keep in mind when looking at that winning trip analysis. But whether you're on the inner turf or the melon turf, not a lot of success going gate to wire in those instances. Now, in the inner turf course, we've actually seen closers doing incredibly well. 33 races have been run, and over half, 54.5% of horses have come from more than 3 lengths back at the half-mile mark. So that's something that's particularly noteworthy. And we've seen closers and trackers do equally well on the melon turf course, about 43% of each being able to close from tracking within 3 lengths or closing from more than 3 lengths off the pace. So interesting, though, you definitely want to be coming from off the pace. Those gate to wire winners are a little bit more challenged in this regard. Now, when a turf course takes on a lot of water, which our turf course has taken on some water and will take on some more water this week, it is noteworthy that sometimes, and this is not true at all turf courses, and I would strongly recommend that you pay attention during the early stages of those races when they're running the turf. Sometimes the turf will play like a little bit of a merry-go-round and it'll play a little bit just like running in place. And it's really hard to get a lot of passing done. And so in some instances, when you're running over a softer track, you do want to be up closer to the front because sometimes that turn of foot from the horses in the back is negated because of track conditions. Again, not always, not every track. It's something I would encourage you to really pay attention to during the early stages of any card where you have had precipitation and moisture over the turf course in the previous 24 to 48 hours. Well, let's wrap up by sharing a couple of other little tidbits here. First of all, our stat of the week. What's it going to be? Well, believe it or not, the dirt track, the main track, still playing very well with speed. Only 8% of dirt sprint winners have closed from more than 3 lengths back at the half-mile mark. So again, you want to be forward in those dirt sprints. Is that shocking? Not necessarily, but 8.7 is a pretty small percentage of winners. I think it's only 6 out of 69 dirt sprint races have been won by horses coming from more than 3 lengths back at the half-mile mark or the 3/8 mile mark, whichever one we use, depending on the distance of the race. Now, obviously, want to make sure that you check out all of our other track stats we have for Del Mar, we got for Monmouth Park, we got for Assiniboia Downs. So we got a lot of great content for you here to help you out, connect you with some more data, hopefully connect you with winners, help you understand how these tracks are playing at different tracks across the country. And people ask me, Matthew, where are we going to go next with track stats? Well, listen, when Saratoga is over, obviously we're going to go down to the city. We're going to continue to look at how Aqueduct is playing during the Belmont at the Big A meet, as well as the winter meet. But we're also going to look at Championship Meet at Gulfstream Park. We're going to look at Santa Anita. We're going to look at Keeneland. You know we're going to look at Keeneland. And yes, we're going to look at Turfway Park as well. So we're going to have a lot of fun with all of that in the fall going into the winter. Like I said, make sure to like this video. Subscribe to the new NYRA Bets YouTube channel. We got a lot of great content for you coming up this week and next week. We got a lot of stuff getting you ready for the Travers. A lot of great stuff getting you ready for later this fall. And a lot of stuff even starting to get ready for the Breeders' Cup as well. So we have a lot of fun ideas that we're going to be sharing with you here on NYRA Bets YouTube. Well, listen, friends, until next time, my name is Matthew DeSantis, wishing you a great and prosperous day at the races and reminding you that it's now post time.